Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining Holistic Child and Families Neurodiversity Consult. Today we have KJ Glaves, who is a brilliant brained fellow overfunctioning neurodivergent who I love very much and have known for more than a decade in various workspaces. I'm so excited for this presentation. KJ, please take it from me.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. I'm KJ or Katie Jo. I am really excited to be here because when Marie asked me to do this, I was like, oh, wait, this is a differential that's really important that I have to think about a lot. But also, I didn't know how to explain it to people. So this presentation kind of forced me to sit down and like lay out my thinking on the differences between PDA, OCD, and trauma. And I want to give a little bit of background that might help y'all kind of understand where I'm coming from. And I'm also somebody who likes to see faces. And what I found is if I share my screen, then I can't see your lovely faces, and that makes me sad. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm dropping in chat a link to the slideshow so that you can follow along with my written presentation. So please, like if you are somebody who likes to read along, go for it, follow along. If not, like that could be a resource that you kind of keep for yourself as well. Um, so some background on me. I've been working with neurodivergent folks for almost 15 years as a clinician, which is kind of wild for me to recognize I'm almost at that point. And I always tell people I came to working with neurodivergent folks very accidentally when Jenny went on maternity leave and left me with an entire caseload at Sound Mental Health. And I said, wait, these are like this is the type of client I want to work with. And it makes sense because I'm neurodivergent too. And like it just all started clicking then. I came to OCD work much later. When I entered private practice, and I was the only child, one of the only child therapists at a particular place, and I was handed some kids with OCD who are also neurodivergent, and was basically like, I have to figure this out because nobody else is. And so I kind of geared up to learn and learn quite a bit about OCD. And so I do love treating folks with OCD and neurodivergence, like kind of like the intersection between those two things, because there's so much really interesting work that can be done. And also, OCD can be so disruptive to people's daily lives. And so, kind of knowing how to treat it appropriately and knowing how to support folks is really important to me. So, I'm always excited to talk about anything related to OCD. So, I'm really excited to be here. I always joke that I evangelize like learning more about OCD for people because it is something that most of us run into. And if you don't know appropriate ways to treat it or support folks with OCD, you can do a lot of damage, unfortunately. So it's something where I'm going to say like I want us to be like talk about the appropriate ways to treat OCD always, and I'm always going to be supportive. If you have questions about OCD in the future, reach out. Okay, I do love talking about this. Um, let's talk about why this differential. So, OCD, PDA, and trauma. We know that there are a lot of neurodivergent people who have overlapping symptoms of all of those particular things. And what we're going to see is a very confusing clinical picture at times when somebody comes in and they're struggling usually with concern about avoidance. I don't want to do this thing. I can't do this thing. This thing is scary. And the question can become, what is actually happening? So they can look similar. Let's review quickly, like just the overview of each, and then we're going to talk about the factors that make them look similar and the ways we can differentiate between them. So I don't always love language around PDA. Pathological demand avoidance is not my favorite name for it. I much prefer the persistent drive for autonomy. But I think the thing that stands out to me about PDA the most is that anxiety about things that clients want to do. I want to do this thing, but I put this demand on myself, and now I can't do this thing. That to me is like the very clearly distinguishing PDA trait. I'm excited about, once I become excited about going to my friend's house, now it feels like a demand and I can't go. That is like to me the thing that makes me go, okay, this is probably PDA. So that first trait is resistance or avoidance of everyday demands. And this can change rapidly. And we're going to talk about how that influences differentials in a bit. There's a high need for autonomy. There's a high need to want to manage your own life. This in adults may not be as noticeable, but in kids it can be particularly noticeable. You also see mood lability a bit with PDA stuff. I have a hard time separating sometimes that from like conflict with other people around the drive for autonomy. So sometimes I don't love that trait, but it is in the criteria by the PDA Society, so I'm including it. This idea of surface sociability, like kind of being able to use more social strategies for avoidance, and we're going to talk about that in a sec as well. And then this idea that is in the criteria that's really interesting when we're doing this differential of obsessive behavior towards other people, kind of having like a person who somebody is obsessed with. And that's the actual language that you'll see in the PDA criteria put out in the UK. And then often comfortable with role play, imaginative play. So that's kind of like the PDA profile. I will point out PDA is not in the DSM. And I think there's a lot of debate about whether it will make it into the next DSM. I tend to think it won't. But I do think that it's a useful construct for us as clinicians because there is data to suggest that there's a difference in profiles for folks who have this kind of PDA profile versus potentially some other things. So I think this is a useful thing to know about. Then OCD. What is OCD? Avoidance of people, place, things that trigger obsessions. Using rituals, having a high anxiety or fear about certain topics or things. And then kind of this need for reassurance from other people, sometimes related to these areas of obsession, these areas that you can't get out of your head. This idea of intrusive thoughts is pretty big with OCD. I kind of describe intrusive thoughts to my clients. I work with kids generally as thoughts that jump into your head and then you can't get them out of there. Kind of like they're jumping around in your brain, waving their arms, going, "Pay attention, pay attention." Because a lot of my clients describe their intrusive thoughts in those ways. And then trauma. Now, I want to name a lot of neurodivergent people have trauma. I would actually say that trauma underlies a lot of neurodivergence. And this can be something that makes it tricky because if everyone I see has trauma, where is the trauma and where is the OCD and where is autism PDA stuff? It can be really confusing. And also, when we're thinking about this differential, we're looking at trauma. We're going to talk mostly about the trauma-related avoidance because that's where we're going to see some overlap. So with trauma in general, we see avoidance of reminders of trauma, lability of mood, some hypervigilance, maybe feeling more detached kind of from everyday life. Guilt, shame, and fear are going to be themes that come up, and then re-experiencing symptoms. And then one of the criteria for trauma is having experienced a trauma. Now, note that many of our clients won't necessarily name trauma as trauma. They're going to say, well, this thing happened to me, and they may have the language for it, and we might have to be thinking about this. I am using a wider definition of trauma than PTSD in the DSM because that's a pretty limited definition. Every time I teach psychopathology and review that definition, I get slightly annoyed because of how limited it is and how some of the carve-outs are very odd. Okay, so those are some overviews of those three things that we're going to be talking about in depth. The commonality in my experience between these three things and where I have to sort through is this idea of avoidance. So in PDA, demands lead to anxiety, which leads to avoidance, which leads to that demand refusal that we see as characteristic of PDA. In OCD, obsessions lead to fear, which leads to avoidance. And in trauma, memories or reminders of trauma lead to fear, which lead to avoidance. But what we're seeing, the behavior, the exterior thing, is often going to be avoidance. And as a child therapist, what this looks like is parents who come into my office and say, I don't understand, my kid won't go to school. Or it's going to look like a teenager who says, I just won't do that thing. That's too hard, or that's too scary, or that's too much. Any of that language I might hear. It's going to look like I'm seeing the avoidance. And frankly, with kids, avoidance is what people are usually most worried about. Why won't this client speak in class? Why won't this client go to the bathroom at school? Why won't this kid do this thing? And the answer, the underlying reason, is what we should be curious about. What I find with kids is a lot of the solutions that people want to offer are going to be behavioral, right? Like, this kid doesn't want to do this, so let's offer them a reward. And like, if there's there a lot of times that's ignoring the bigger issue, and frankly annoys me because it can really do some harm to kids to be taught that like they basically have to teach themselves to ignore their feelings in order to get a reward, which long term is not great for many of our neurodivergent clients. So we need to be thinking about the underlying pieces here. I'm not saying rewards are always bad. There's times like where I do have clients reward themselves for doing hard things, but I don't love it when it's the only tool in the toolbox. And so I want us to be thinking about rewards with nuance here. So how do we tell the difference between the types of avoidance that we're thinking about, between this PDA avoidance, the OCD avoidance, and the trauma avoidance? We're going to have to spend some time doing a differential. And so I'm thinking about the what, how, and why of the avoidance. And so we're going to run through some questions over the next couple slides, if you're following along, and going to talk about what avoidance will look like in each of these scenarios and where you might see overlap. And I'm also going to point out along the way, I'm acting like you're going to pick only one of these. But the reality is, for many of us, is that I have clients have PDA and also OCD. I have clients who have experienced significant trauma and have OCD. Like those things can coexist. So there's also going to be a conversation around, if you have a client who has overlap here, where are you going to want to be able to support the client in figuring out what way of addressing it is the most appropriate? And we'll discuss that at the end. But I am going to be treating it as like you're going to only pick one, just for simplicity's sake over the next couple slides. All right. So the first question you should ask yourself and work on figuring out with the client is, what is the client avoiding? Now, you're going to get an answer right away. This client's avoiding school, right? Let's just use this as an example. However, when somebody's not going to school, a lot of the times that if we treat it like school is the answer, that's not actually enough information. Are they avoiding being in the presence of peers? Are they avoiding the germs that they believe are everywhere in the school building? Are they avoiding the anxiety of demands and expectations that their teachers place upon them? Are they avoiding a particular person at school who has done something harmful to them? We need more information. If you are not having the slides, I will drop the link again. I apologize. I like to see people's faces when I can, so I am not doing a formal slideshow, but you are welcome to follow along with the slides. We are on slide 4. So what does the client avoid? So in PDA, we're going to see clients who are trying to avoid that loss of autonomy. Clients who are trying to say, like, I want to be able to make my own structures. I want to be able to make my own world the way I need it. There's a lot of times where there's an avoidance of expectation. So in school, if the issue is like the surface issue is school avoidance, what I'm going to hear from somebody with PDA is something along the lines of, I don't like it because all the teachers expect me to get good grades, and that makes me really nervous, and I don't want to go. And like, or I don't like that I feel this pressure to like be the good kid. Like, you're going to hear this kind of like internal narrative of like these expectations wig me out in some ways. They make me feel uncomfortable, and then I don't want to go to school. And everyone's now upset with me that I don't want to go to school, and so it's going to turn into a whole big family thing. You also will note with PDA that PDA is going to be significantly more changeable than the other two, than OCD or trauma. So PDA shifts more day to day. One day somebody might be able to tolerate going to school, and the next day it is absolutely intolerable. So I see more shift with PDA than I do with OCD or with trauma. So PDA is more depending on how much the client may be experiencing a demand, and like is going to also think of the client's cognition comes in there. How much do I perceive that other people are putting a demand on me at this point in time? The more demand perceived is probably the more avoidance you're going to see. So you can sometimes get shifts depending on the teacher who, if they have a class schedule that's like one set of classes one day, then one set of classes the next day, you might see that they're able to go on Tuesday, Thursdays, but not on Monday, Wednesdays. And that's going to be pretty notable to pay attention to. With OCD, you're going to see an avoidance of people, places, things that trigger obsessions and anxiety. So for school, what I'm going to hear things like is, I don't like going to school because I'm scared that everyone thinks I'm a bad person. A morality based obsession might be present there. Or I'm scared I'm going to accidentally hurt somebody on the playground. So I don't want to go to school because what if I go on the playground and I run around and I end up running into somebody and they get hurt and then I get in trouble? You're going to hear kind of like more specifics potentially than with PDA, and it's probably going to link to an area of obsession. I will remind folks who are maybe not as OCD familiar that like the most common form of obsession that we're going to hear are things related to harm, fear of hurting others or of being hurt. And then you're also going to hear a lot of morality-based obsessions as well as kind of the contamination stuff. But actually germs, which are our OCD stereotype, are less common than both the morality and the harm kind of obsessions that you're going to see. And so I want us to be aware of that fact, because the harm stuff sometimes is unfamiliar to people, but it's very common for my clients to have some degree of fear of hurting others. If you're in a classroom, there's lots of people to bump into, there's scissors, there's all these things that a client might perceive as dangerous. And so sometimes you'll hear, like if we're taking that school avoidance example of like, I'm avoiding school because of fear of those things. There might be a ritual component. I can go to school if my parents say the right things to me at the right time to like reassure me that school is safe. Or if like I can do this one thing that makes me feel safe, or if I could like, there might be like a ritual component here. Not always, but a lot of times there will be that ritual component. Sometimes also noting that these can be internal. And so they may not always be super obvious, but sometimes I ask clients, like, is there something you have to think to be able to engage with this thing that's scary? Is there like like kind of a mental ritual that folks have to go through? That's often an invisible part of OCD. Things like I have to pray this prayer before I do this thing that's scary, and that's always something to ask about because people often miss that's happening. And then trauma. So trauma is going to be specific to a person, place, or thing that reminds them of a trauma. So this kid bullied me relentlessly last year, and I don't want to go to school because I will see him and then I'm going to feel that way again. There's going to be maybe some detachment, or guilt or shame. I'm a bad person because because I let him hurt me. That kind of thing is going to come up. And again, that trauma, like having experienced this trauma here. And so again, that's going to be more specific than the more general PDA. It's also going to be very consistent. Maybe this is a client who says, if this kid wasn't at my school, I'd be able to go to school. And you could even test that sometimes. Like I've had clients when they switch schools, all of a sudden are able to return to school when prior they weren't, because the avoidance wasn't about being worried about hurting people on the playground or demands. The avoidance was about a particular place or person that was present at that school. And when they changed schools, that was no longer present. And then they were able to go. So it's worth noting that as well. Like there's ways to test some of this with clients, especially with clients who are having a harder time explaining things. So that's our first question. What does the client avoid? Then what strategies are used for avoidance? People avoid things in different ways. And while there's going to be overlap between the way people avoid things, there's also going to be some things that are more notable. So for PDA, you're going to see this more talkative, more social strategy. Maybe like somebody who is like, oh, I'm going to distract everyone in my life by like talking a lot about this thing I'm really excited about so that they don't ask me about this thing that makes me uncomfortable. I'm going to use this kind of sociability strategy that is pretty effective, actually, to kind of avoid some of those demands potentially. So there also might be more imaginative and role play kind of things being named, or like kind of, I always think about like dramatic statements like, my leg is broken and now I can't go to school. And like where clients like using this kind of way of like kind of using their imagination and hoping to bring along others for the ride is a strategy that's very unique to PDA. I rarely see this with OCD, and I almost never see this with trauma. It's gonna feel more like this client is using these very sociable strategies. There's other things that can happen as well, like especially if push folks with PDA can have outbursts. In general, this is a generality, but oftentimes folks with PDA are less embarrassed by their outbursts than folks with OCD or trauma. Not in every case, but that is more general. Um, in OCD, you're going to see a refusal to do something without an explanation of why. I just can't. And if there is, it is a why, it might make no sense. And the client probably knows this. So if they give me a why, a lot of times clients will say, I don't want to do this because I'm worried if I go to that place, my mom will die. And I know that doesn't make any sense, Katie Jo, but I'm still worried about it. That is very OCD. Be able to be like, there's a level of this, I know logically this doesn't connect, but emotionally it feels so true, I can't do the thing. That's so OCD characteristic that it's really important that we recognize that difference. There's also going to be this hiding or sneaking of rituals. Like there might be stuff that the client feels like they have to do rituals that are and like they're going to like try to do them on the sly or like in a way that their parents or other people don't notice that kind of keep them feeling safe, but also like allow them to be able to do this thing that otherwise they would avoid. The classic example is like having to pray things or like do something a certain number of times, tapping things. I see a lot of clients who have some of those ritual behaviors that are about like avoiding the anxiety of having to do something that is otherwise overwhelmingly anxiety provoking. And then trauma. Refusal to do something, the client usually will go to fight, flight, or will go into fight, flight, or freeze. With trauma, this is really common that you see kids who freeze, refuse to get out of the car. A lot of my kids with PTSD or trauma related stuff, when forced to do something, will freeze. They just won't move on. It can lead to an outburst, kind of that fight response. But usually with trauma, I first see freezing or attempts to flee or run away. I will also say that trauma is a newer thing, right? Like usually trauma is after a certain time period. Like there's a before and an after. Before this thing was doable, now it's not. Something changed. And that's going to be pretty noticeable as well. And clients might awesome. All right. So strategies. Now let's discuss a bit what reasons are given. When you ask the client why, what's the client saying to you? This is usually one of the best ways we have. And also, I'll point out with younger clients, it's harder, right? Because the younger kids may not be as able to give as much information when they're explaining stuff. So just recognize that there can be some tricky pieces with the under 10 set here in particular. So what reasons are given for avoidance? With a PDA profile, it's often non-specific. You hear a lot of I can't, I don't, that doesn't, I just can't do this thing, it doesn't work, I won't. That kind of language is more common with PDA. And it's much more confusing because it's going to change day by day. So there's not a consistency there. One day I can brush my teeth, the next day I can't. And it's not tied to like a particular, this is always scary. It's tied to like the perceived intensity of demand, which is very different. And again, that day by day change. And then that play acting humor being used. I can't do this on Tuesdays. I can't do this, if somebody with red hair asked me to do it. Like there's a whole bunch of things that you'll hear clients kind of pull out of like, these are the reasons given. And with PDA, it doesn't make sense. And like the client's kind of using it as like kind of a distraction piece here because it's hard for them to explain. And they usually with folks with PDA, there's a level of feeling anxiety and potentially some guilt because it's a demand when you ask a question. So you're asking them to explain, and that you're placing a demand by doing that. which is a whole interesting piece of PDA work. Um, with OCD, there's always going to be a reason, but the reason may not make sense. Um, the reason might be something like I can't go to the bathroom because this other person is using it and they have uses it and they have germs. Like there's a reason. The client probably knows that like they could clean the bathroom. There could be that ritual piece of there, like to feel better, but also like there's going to potentially be like a reason that kind of ties to these underlying obsessive fears. Um, and then the themes will be somewhat consistent. There may be specifics, especially over time. OCD tends to increase. So, what might be possible for somebody that are like, well, I can go to the bathroom at school if I'm able to bring a Lysol wipe and I can wipe things down. And that works for a while until something makes them feel like that's not good enough. And then they need to do more to clean the bathroom, or they begin avoiding it altogether. So like you'll see with OCD that sometimes the need for ritualize the compulsion stuff will increase over time, but is going to be maybe a slower increase. And again, it's going to make more logical sense. And there's often, but not always, there's a connection between the compulsion or ritual and the obsession. Again, not always. Sometimes they don't link up in your brain, but there's like a link in the client's brain. So like I always ask the clients to kind of explain it to me. And sometimes clients are like, I don't actually know why, but this does work. And I'm like, okay, that can be OCD. And then with trauma, there's going to be a reason that often links back to a particular event or particular time. I can't do this because last time I did this, X happened. It may also be rooted in reminders. I can't go into math class anymore because last time I was in math class, this thing happened. So you're going to see like kind of this reminder in the past is going to come up more frequently. Folks with OCD sometimes have something like that, or PDA will sometimes have something like that. But a lot of the time with trauma, that's going to be the distinguishing factor. It's tied to a past event. And the avoidance is probably pretty consistent. So there's going to be consistent avoidance there as well. All right. If there are any questions, please stop. Oh, question. Love a good question. Oh, but so that's a really good question. So specific phobias and OCD overlap to a significant degree, right? In some ways, OCD is somebody who has multiple phobias that have generalized more so than having a single specific phobia. So what I'm going to say is that with specific phobias is going to be a more focused type of OCD. So like the specific phobia is going to be related to I can't go to the basement of my house because there are spiders. And I also can't go to the zoo insect house because there are spiders. It's going to be like there's a clear reason, but that one thing might underlie multiple types of avoidance, but it's going to be like tied to only a singular reason, not multiple reasons like with OCD. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think I just have a situation in mind too that all of this is making me recontextualize and kind of think about of wondering also about like that trauma piece sometimes if like let's say the specific phobia has started after an event has happened and again trauma being kind of of course that a word is always loaded and means lots of things, right? But for that person and then the avoidance starts afterwards. And yeah, just it's interesting because I'm processing all of those kind of um all of those things where there isn't necessarily like a OCD in terms of there's no clear, I mean, there's not necessarily super clear compulsions in a classic sense, but just the avoidance, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, I guess I'm just processing partially, but any other thoughts that you have on all those crossovers is helpful.
Yeah, no, I mean, I very much conceptualize phobias and OCD as existing in a very similar realm. It's just like the focus of treatment in OCD is like many different things, whereas the focus in phobias is really like this thing, like this one particular arena, usually. So it's just like that's how I've conceptualized it, and it's generally worked. I treat a lot of specific phobias in the context of like other related client concerns. And like again, like the the OCD and phobia treatment for me overlap quite a bit in the way I address stuff. All right. So what emotions come up when the client can't avoid? When the situation is inevitable. I have to do this thing. I'm being forced, but everyone in my life is saying I have to get a shot or I have to go to school or people push the issue, which does happen for a lot of our clients. It's going to look very similar in some ways. The PDA profile, you're going to see anxiety, but it may be hard to explain that why, agitation, and then we're going to move to anger. In OCD, it's a fear of a specific thing or a specific outcome. I'm scared if I do this, my mom will die. I'm scared if I do this, I'm going to hurt somebody. I'm scared if I do this, I'm going to get really sick. And then you're going to see like increasing levels of agitation, and then potentially that anger coming up at times, like outbursts. For OCD in younger kids, like the sub 10 set, a lot of times people are referred for therapy, not for OCD, but because they're having big behavioral outbursts at home and parents don't know why, and they come to therapy for behavioral issues and it's actually OCD. So you're going to see that a lot with kiddos. And then for trauma, you're going to see this fear of trauma reoccurring and or of having flashbacks or re-experiencing symptoms, and then that agitation, and then potentially anger for a lot of these. So you're going to see a similar kind of outburst, like potential thing when people are pushed, and also a lot of times what the problem is like being able to discern that early moment where they're like afraid or anxious about something. What is it? We want to know that to be able to really determine which of these differentials is the right answer. What is the involvement of other people in avoidance? I want to talk about this because I'm a family therapist. That's my jam. More people in the room, the better is always my motto. But I always tell people like almost every form of avoidance is like, it's really, I see, Lana, did I get you with that one?
Hi, Katie Jo, I love you. You're so funny because I'll like present having multiple people in the room at my other consult or whatever, and they'll be like, "Yana, so weird. Just like narrow it down." And then you're like, "Mom," and I'm like, "It's a part."
Grandma, bring your dog. Whoever can come, the better. I'm a family therapist. It's my jam. So both PDA and OCD and trauma all are going to involve other people in the client's life. We cannot treat them in isolation, particularly in kids, but even in adults. I work with a lot of young adults. It is really important that I understand the way other people intersect with whatever is going on. We cannot pretend like it's a singular thing. So with PDA profile, the classic thing we see is they have a favorite person or a co-regulator. I think of this person as like the chosen co-regulator for this client who they want to go to for that regulation that folks need. Folks, PDA need a lot of co-regulation. This is what you're going to see the most often. Classically, this is usually a parent. Sometimes in adults, it can be a partner. So they have this co-regulator. Now, a co-regulating adult for somebody with PDA is probably going to be able to use creative strategies, maybe some declarative language, maybe some playfulness to kind of work through some of this avoidance. There may be some rituals, there may be some reassurance seeking, but it's not going to be quite as strong. And there's going to be this way out for that co-regulator to be able to like work with the avoidance in more creative ways. In OCD, you're not going to see that. You're going to see more rigidity. You're going to see more rituals and rules for how people have to behave. I think back to a client I had where the bedtime routine over the course of a couple years had gone from, a 10-minute ritual to a, up to 2-hour ritual where everyone had an assigned part and everyone had to play their part. And if they weren't playing their part correctly, then everyone had to redo their part. So it was taking up to 2 hours some nights for this kid to be able to go to bed because the rituals had become somewhat calcified and everybody had their lines and what they had to do. And if they didn't do it right and it didn't feel right, it had to be redone. There will be some reassurance seeking. Note, reassurance seeking, asking the same question over and over again, asking, will this be okay? Will this be okay? Will this be okay? Classically, pet peeve here. Classically, ERP, which I am trained in, says that parents should just stop answering that question. And I've come to believe that's really, really mean and also terrible for attachment, which is really important. I have parents prompt the kid to reassure themselves. So the parent's not offering reassurance, but the parent's also offering connection, saying something like, sweetheart, I did answer that question. I will often have parents tell them that they can answer the question once, they write down their answer, then they can tell their kid, like, sweetheart, I already answered that question today. Can you please go check the answer I wrote down? Things like that. Or can you please reassure yourself? There are ways you can do it that are kinder than classic ERP. Many things I like about ERP, many things I dislike. But I do think that reassurance is really important. But you're not going to see creative fun strategies working. You can't play a game to get somebody with OCD to do something that's really feared usually. There are exceptions to that in creative OCD treatment. Sometimes I can, but it's explicitly for treatment. It's not like a day-to-day thing. And co-regulation is helpful, but it's really not enough to address OCD, y'all. I love co-regulation, and also co-regulation in and of itself is not enough to stop obsessions and compulsions. And then trauma. Folks who have experienced trauma absolutely need co-regulation, especially when trauma reminders come up. They need that. The co-regulation can really help clients face those reminders of trauma. If you're doing a trauma narrative, I'm trained in TFCBT, and I do a lot of creative TFCBT style interventions for trauma. And having a co-regulating adult can be super helpful for kids who are trying to tell their trauma story. But again, it's not enough in and of itself. It doesn't resolve everything, but it can be really helpful. There will be some reassurance seeking with trauma, but it's going to be more specific, and it does work. So in OCD, generally speaking, reassurance works only for a little bit until that doubt creeps back in and then the question gets asked again. In trauma, it's more likely the reassurance will actually set and work and take hold and not spiral out into I have to ask the question again and again. Because the difference between trauma and OCD is all about doubt. I am reassured for a second, and then doubt enters in again, and I have to ask or I have to do the ritual again because I'm scared I didn't do it right or I didn't get the answer, I forgot the answer. And that kind of internal narrative with OCD is so pernicious and so hard for folks. All right. Now that we know how to differentiate, and you probably are like, oh my gosh, this is so much information. It's a lot of information. But I am hoping that you have the slideshow to refer to. Oh, yes. The BPD thing, I'm looking at your comment, and this one, it's so common for people to be like, this is BPD. And it's like, no, there's a lot of complexity, and rarely do I think that's the right answer. A lot of times we have to figure out what is actually happening, and that's frankly the cheap and easy answer of some types of facilities is to go to that personality disorders. It's not necessarily it's not the right answer so much of the time. So in general, what do you do when you have somebody who has a bunch of the symptomology, and what do you do about different types of avoidance as it comes up? So I always tell people, if the avoidance is sensory based, I don't like the texture of this thing, I can't wear that type of clothes, we accommodate, we leave it be. We do not do exposure therapy, key point here, for sensory needs. There is an exception, which is I occasionally have a client who has done a great course of some exposure therapy willingly. They have consented. They it's worked for them. And they tell me, I do want to do some exposure for this sensory thing because I'd like it to bother me less. If it's client directed, I will help them do it, but I'm not going to propose it. We're not doing exposure therapy for being in a crowd or touching things that feel icky to the client. You can live your life without touching slime. It is not going to be a critical thing. And so for sensory stuff, if it's really life disruptive, I will refer to an OT potentially. But again, generally speaking, do not do exposure therapy, and we accommodate sensory needs. So if the avoidance is related to demands, generally speaking, co-regulation is our go-to. Coach caregivers to do so as well, make life low demand when you can, and support autonomy as much as is feasible. So if avoidance is related to that need for autonomy, we support, we co-regulate, we work with clients using those creative strategies to help them engage with the things that they need to engage with and that they want to engage with. I'm thinking also, what is this client's values? I use a bit of ACT work here sometimes to help clients figure out what they want. And then we work on tolerating some of that anxiety. If the avoidance is trauma related, they need trauma treatment. There's several different ways to process trauma. I always tell people I'm agnostic on exactly how you do it. I have things that I like, but I definitely have clients who they don't jive with my TFCBT stuff, and I refer them to somebody who does EMDR. There's multiple ways to address trauma appropriately, but trauma needs to be addressed. If it's OCD, I do think you should consider exposure therapy or ICBT or some ACT for OCD. Those are all valid ways of approaching this. ERP is first line treatment, generally speaking. I will add, I am suspicious of, I don't refer to just anybody for ERP because a lot of ERP does not take into account neurodivergence very well. And I've had several clients have terrible experiences. So you do need to be like screening pretty carefully and making sure that you're not just referring to somebody who's like, hey, lots of exposure therapy. Let's do the scary thing right now. Like there are times where that's helpful, but I will say that many neurodivergent people, particularly those who've had bad experiences in therapy, that's going to send their nervous system into overdrive and it's not necessarily helpful. You will need some time to work up to exposure therapy with many clients, especially if there's any type of complexity there. So please don't just like, Rogers has a place at times, but I don't necessarily want that to be my go-to because it's often overwhelming for clients' nervous systems. So exposure therapy needs to involve consent. The other thing I preach a lot with exposure therapy is it's not exposure therapy if the client didn't agree to do it. Holding down your kid to give them a shot, not exposure therapy, parents. Sometimes necessary. Like I've held down my kid to get a shot. Most parents have, but that's not exposure for needle phobia. Clients have to agree to exposure therapy for it to be good exposure therapy. So please, please, please think about consent to an immense degree if you're working in any type of exposure and get good training on how to do this. I will add medication is very helpful, particularly for OCD. I actually tell people all the time that I feel mean trying to ask clients to do exposure therapy if they don't have medication in their system, because it is so, I'm asking clients to do the hardest thing, the thing they're most afraid of. And medication is immensely helpful for many clients. A note about medication for OCD, many prescribers are not knowledgeable about OCD dosing, particularly for children, and they keep the dose too low. Generally speaking, the rule for OCD is you want kids to max out the dose of their SSRI, which is wild, but also is super helpful. They will not stay there forever, but it's often helpful when you're doing exposure therapy. All right. Ooh, Mar, that's a hard one. Because so many times the person who's the designated co-regulator is worn out. And I think that this is a place where we have to be thinking about the whole family's needs, because the co-regulator does need to be able to recharge in order to be able to be the adult, the parent, provide that co-regulation. And sometimes it's helping get a little bit of flexibility, help get a little bit of consent from the client to have the co-regulator be able to care for themselves. I often frame it as, I really know you love spending time with your person, and also your person needs that time to be able to feel good so they can enjoy spending time with you too. And we frame it, it's hard. And I also acknowledge that sometimes we have to be thinking about the long term for caregivers. They have to be able to co-regulate over the long term, which means they have to get regular breaks. And people do adjust. Some of my clients with PDA, they really hate it. And also we've just had to acknowledge that it's necessary that their caregiver have a full day off once a week to go and do things that are not being with them. And that can be really important. Whew. Marie, that's scary. What the heck? Yes, co-regulation is super, super important. All right. And then what if your client has more than one of these diagnoses? In general, if trauma and OCD, treat the trauma first. Start with trauma treatment. unless OCD like completely makes everything impossible. Some OCD resolves with trauma treatment. I have seen times where if you do appropriate trauma treatment, OCD kind of starts to resolve on its own or with like a lot less work, which is important. If the client has trauma in PDA, I engage the client as much as is feasible. I expect that it's going to be slower, but I'm also going to get a lot of consent and respect autonomy, and like it will take me for somebody without PDA, I can do exposure therapy often, and it will be like, 4 months until we see a lot of symptoms start to resolve. With PDA at play, it's more like a year, and that's okay. I just, remind myself that sometimes things are different. And then for trauma and PDA, I try to respect that autonomy while also engaging folks in trauma treatment. When in doubt, consult. I customize treatment plans heavily when I have clients with overlapping conditions, especially where we're like, I'm not sure, is the avoidance PDA, is the avoidance OCD? Which one is it? If I'm kind of in that space of going, I don't know, I'm going to be consulting with other people who are knowledgeable. I'm going to be having conversations with my colleagues who are experts in both of these things, so that I can kind of sort through it in my head and know the questions to ask the client. All right, I see a question in the chat. Oh, moral OCD. So I always tell people like morality-based OCD is I think one of the things I'm most fascinated by, because when I took my ERP class, like they talked a lot about like scrupulosity and religious based OCD, but I've come to see what I've termed the Seattle subvariant of morality based OCD, where it's very social justice focused. From like clients who've been waking up in the middle of the night, like to check to make sure they didn't accidentally say something offensive to somebody online, the clients who engage in like hoarding behaviors because they feel like they have to recycle everything. The morality based stuff is different in this town, and it's fascinating. Oh my gosh. So for this, a lot of times I'm helping clients be exposed to what their fears are. Ironically, for me, like The Good Place has been a great TV show for this, because it really does expose people to this idea that like it's really hard to be 100% good person, and what does it mean to like do your best. And I think it's actually been great exposure therapy for clients who have like that social justice variant. The other thing that I've had clients do is they oftentimes are avoiding content that they feel like might be offensive or make them say something offensive. I've actually had a few clients watch South Park as treatment, which is a very funny intervention on some level, but it does actually work for a lot of it for exposure, and it helps clients like be like, wait, I watched that and I didn't say anything bad at school. Maybe I'm okay. And so it's like thinking about some of those things, helping clients engage with those ideas. A lot of it's helping that engagement with ideas more so than like classic ERP where you do something. It's more of that discussion based, as well as sometimes watching or engaging with material that makes clients feel weird about their own sense of morality. Am I a good person if I watch South Park? Yes, you're fine if you watch South Park. There's some terrible things on there, and also like that doesn't make you a bad person is what I tell clients, and that's okay. Any other questions?
I can't type as fast as I can speak. My other question is, have you ever experienced a case where the preferred co-regulating parent of a PDAer, have you ever experienced another person being also a preferred co-regulating person, or have you primarily experienced it like within one individual?
I've had clients who've had a preferred person, but they've had a strong secondary person who they've like also been able to go to, and that's actually really helpful at times, because then we can split the caregiving load a little bit. But it's not, and sometimes you also can kind of set that up by helping another person like learn some of these strategies for co-regulation. I tell people all the time, like figuring out how to help somebody who may not like naturally co-regulate, teaching them how to do that is really helpful in a PDA, like especially co-parenting situation, because I want everyone to be able to regulate the PDA or as much as we can.
Thank you so much.
Katie Jo, do you have thoughts about the golden perfect co-regulator mom's fantasy that she could like cure the patient and then be free? All the way, it's push, push, push all the way to the end, sure, for the next 10 years, 24/7. but at the end it will be like magically resolved, and that's the only possible path we can take to get there.
I think it's okay. So I'm gonna give an answer. And Liana, like you are also trained on the DSM-4, right? So I think one of the things that like is an interesting shift for me is anybody who is trained the DSM-4, anybody who's like old enough to have been in that world, like the multi-axial system where like we had axis one and axis two, and axis two were things presumed to be lifelong. What was in that axis was messed up. But like I do think there's an interesting conversation to be had with families about like what things we expect to be part of your kids' neurological makeup, like the way they are, versus what things are more malleable. And like, how do we talk about that? Because I think that this is a lot of the places where like families struggle with therapy is they're not really clear on this fact. And I do think we have to find ways to be clear with people about like, I if I diagnose somebody with ADHD to me is something that's like that's part of the way you are. It's not like not good or bad, it just is. And like I have ADHD, I'll always have ADHD. It's been part of my neurology since birth. I've had times where I've had a condition like generalized anxiety disorder that was very much like something where I had for a discrete period of time, and then I that circumstances changed or therapy helped, and then I stopped having that. Now I have a tendency towards anxiety, and I bet most of you do too, because we're therapists. And guess what? We all have a tendency towards anxiety. But really and truly, there's a difference between this is part of my neurological makeup or my child's neurological makeup, and this is something that like is more malleable or that might shift throughout my lifespan. Like I will always experience anxiety, but the anxiety might shift. Or maybe it's my stress position. I have a lot of clients who no longer have OCD on my caseload, but their stress position, when they become stressed out by things, they kind of find themselves starting to obsess again. And so for them, it's like recognizing that this is my thing I do when I'm stressed. And so I need to then go and do some exposure therapy. So, Leon, I think for those parents, like it's a lot of psychoeducation around the idea of some things are part of your kid's makeup. That doesn't mean they're always going to be the same way they are today, but they are part of your kid's makeup. How do we help your kid live the best life? How do we help you live your best life? Like it has to be an all everyone working together kind of solution.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, Katie. This particular caregiver I'm thinking of, she's not gonna have any sense that they're out of the woods. Do you know what I mean? She's still gonna have a sense that she needs to go 1,000%, but she is gonna be able to do your kid was in residential a year ago and now your kid's at home stable. And can we talk about your parenting being at all different between these two
Yes,
versus like, yeah, like lifelong, what's it gonna look like? Like she'll be able to do that. That's very helpful. Thank you.
I'm glad.
Also, that's a very helpful point about OCD like peaking up during times of stress. I hadn't thought about that at all, Katie Jo.
No, it's a whole thing of like I have a bunch of clients on my caseload where I can watch it come back up again, like as soon as the stress comes up. And like again, they've not met the criteria for OCD formally for in many cases over a couple of years, but still when that thing happens, it peaks up again. Um, and then how can somebody support themselves with so like body so like it's like not taking care of your body.
So like if I am so hungry, like I'm physically sick, I still don't want to eat because it's like too overwhelming for my nervous system, so I just won't. Or like I do that with using the bathroom until I'm about to pee myself. And I'm like, well, it's gonna be worse if I don't just go.
Yeah.
Right? So like I maybe it's a little much to get into here, but I love you, KJ. I consider you, a great friend and colleague. So, like, you might know.
I mean, I think some of it is helping people also recognize what are ways they can preemptively meet those needs on a regular basis. So like for a lot of my clients, it's like being able to like on a regular basis eat something and like just be like this is or like have like multiple snack breaks so you can refuse one but like maybe the next one you'll be able to do. So I have a lot of clients who we set something up like that where every hour let's have a snack and they're like well I don't want a snack this hour and it's like that's fine but then you'll get a reminder in the next hour and sometimes that can help some people. It doesn't help everybody by the way but it can help to have it be more scheduled.
That
Not
makes sense. I run a
yeah.
loose ship in my brain, so schedules don't always, when I get reminders, I'm like, I don't have to listen to that lady. Like, she doesn't know what she's talking about.
I also tell people
But that makes sense.
fun reminders or like reminders that like happen more naturally like whenever this happens I do this other thing like kind of that can be a more flexible way. One of the best things for me is my life runs on a 50-minute calendar given that I'm a therapist and so like every 50 minutes I have a chance to do something and so like I end up always doing something for my body every hour and that does help. Okay, what do I dislike about like and dislike about ERP? What I love about ERP is it works. It is highly effective. Oh my gosh, ERP can be great in that way. What I dislike about it is people who are only ERP therapists, who they live and breathe ERP and do nothing else, often miss nuance. They miss the nuance of like that there are multiple ways to address things. They miss the nuance that like while exposure therapy is great, you can't exposure therapy your way out of everything. They sometimes miss like the greater meaning of symptomology because they're so focused on we don't need to understand the why, we just need to do exposure. And I don't like that part of it. I do think ERP is useful, but I find that a lot of ERP clinicians are extremists in ways, or like people who solely do ERP are extremists. And I don't jive with extremism in this, especially for this, because again, OCD in many ways is like a condition where people are very extreme about things. This thing is always dangerous, and I never can do it. And the fact that treatment then becomes like about extremes is very interesting to me. So I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts on that. And I greatly enjoyed. I did the BTTI from the IOCDF, and like I think it was a great training. But also I have a more diverse practice than just OCD, and I'm glad. The majority of folks I treat who have OCD are autistic as well. That's the most common combination on my caseload. All right, y'all. I know you have consult, and I think I just talked everyone's ear off for an entire hour. So
KJ, you were so lovely. Thank you so much for being here. I
thank you
enjoyed
for having me.
so much and your heart. Thank you. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, shout out to my present and future clients who, if I have asked you to watch this, it is because of a reason.